At 8:47 p.m., with snow falling so hard it blurred the streetlights into pale halos, Hannah Bailey struggled through the frozen sidewalks carrying a trembling Labrador wrapped in a faded blue knitted scarf. Her worn lunch tin knocked softly against her leg with every step, while melting snow soaked through her boots. When the front door finally swung open, the man inside froze as the dog rushed into his arms. He reached for his car keys without hesitation. "Please," he said, "let me drive you home." Hannah smiled, exhausted but calm. "No, thank you. Someone's waiting for me, too." She disappeared back into the white storm before he could say another word. If you've ever witnessed an act of kindness you'll never forget, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about ordinary people changing lives speak to your heart, we'd love to have you join us for this journey. Every weekday began the same way for Hannah Bailey, long before the rest of Minneapolis had fully awakened. At exactly 5:15 a.m., the soft chime of an old alarm clock broke the silence inside Apartment 3B of the Cedar Grove Apartments, a modest brick building where the heating pipes rattled louder than the neighbors. Hannah reached over before the second chime, switching it off so it wouldn't wake her 8-year-old son too abruptly. Outside the kitchen window, another January morning waited beneath a blanket of snow. Inside the apartment smelled faintly of oatmeal laundry detergent and the cinnamon candles she only lit on weekends because replacing them wasn't in the budget. She stood quietly for a moment, stretching her sore back before pulling on a faded gray cardigan. The previous evening had ended with shelved books, frozen sidewalks, and another hour spent balancing bills at the tiny kitchen table after Ethan had gone to bed. Some nights she wondered which exhausted version of herself would greet the next sunrise. Then she remembered why she kept getting up. She padded down the hallway and gently pushed open Ethan's bedroom door. The little boy was buried beneath a dinosaur blanket, one arm wrapped around a library book he had fallen asleep reading. She smiled. "You'll ruin your eyesight before you're 10, she whispered affectionately. Without opening his eyes, Ethan mumbled, "Worth it." That made her laugh every single time. By 5:40, breakfast was ready. A pot of oatmeal simmered on the stove, while 2 slices of toast browned unevenly in an aging toaster that occasionally needed a gentle tap to keep working. Hannah packed Ethan's lunch a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and 2 homemade oatmeal cookies she'd baked on Sunday evening. She wished she could add more. Children rarely complained about what was missing until they sat beside classmates who had plenty. Ethan never complained. Instead, he always thanked her. "Mom," he said as he walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Did it snow all night?" She looked through the frosted window. "It never really stopped." He grinned. "Everything looks new." Hannah loved that about him. Where adults saw inconvenience, Ethan still saw wonder. While he ate breakfast, Hannah quietly folded yesterday's electric bill and slipped it into the kitchen drawer beneath several others. The repair estimate for her old silver sedan remained underneath them. Transmission replacement, $3,480. She had stared at that number enough to memorize every digit. The car had been parked behind the building for almost 4 months now. Every week she promised herself she'd save enough to fix it. Every week another expense arrived first. School supplies, winter boots, medicine, rent. Life always seemed to know exactly how much money she had left. When Ethan finished eating, Hannah helped zip up his winter coat. It had belonged to another boy before him. She had replaced the zipper herself with blue thread that didn't quite match. "You fixed it better than new," Ethan declared proudly. "No," Hannah answered with a smile. "Just well enough to last." That sentence seemed to describe nearly everything in their lives. At 6:35, Mrs. Alvarez from downstairs arrived to watch Ethan before school. The retired elementary school teacher refused payment. Instead, every Friday, Hannah brought her homemade soup. Neither woman called it charity. It was simply neighbors taking care of each other. "Morning, sweetheart," Mrs. Alvarez greeted Ethan. "Morning." Then she looked at Hannah. "You're walking again." Hannah nodded. "The buses are running late after the storm." Mrs. Alvarez frowned. "You work too hard." Hannah smiled politely. "Someone has to keep all those books in order." She pulled on her knit hat, wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, and stepped outside. The cold bit immediately. Her apartment building sat nearly a mile from the nearest bus stop. The sidewalks had only been partially cleared. Each careful step left crisp footprints behind. The wind pushed against her as if trying to convince her to stay home. She kept walking. The city slowly awakened around her. A coffee shop unlocked its doors. A maintenance crew shoveled fresh snow. Parents scraped ice from windshields while children waited impatiently with oversized backpacks. Sometimes Hannah imagined what life would be like if her own car worked again. She could sleep another 40 minutes. She wouldn't arrive at work with numb fingers. She wouldn't need to check bus schedules every evening. But wishing never repaired transmissions. So she simply walked. The Minneapolis Public Library branch occupied a beautifully restored brick building that had stood for nearly a century. The front doors opened at 8. Hannah always arrived before 7:30. She loved the silence before visitors came. Books had a way of making quiet feel welcoming instead of lonely. She switched on reading lamps one by one, straightened chairs, returned books to their proper shelves, smoothed the corners of children's rugs where story time was held. To Hannah, libraries weren't simply buildings. They were places where people could breathe without spending money. Before long, regular visitors began arriving. An elderly veteran came every morning to read newspapers because he could no longer afford a subscription. A college student spent hours applying for scholarships. A young mother brought twin toddlers just to keep them warm until afternoon. Hannah knew almost every name. More importantly, she remembered every story. Late that morning, a little girl stood nervously holding a chapter book. "I think this is too hard." Hannah knelt beside her. "Maybe." The girl looked disappointed. "But tell me something." "What?" "When you learned to ride a bicycle, did you start with the easiest hill?" The girl giggled. "No." "Exactly." The child hugged the book tighter. "I'll try." "I know you will." Watching moments like that never felt like work. Around lunchtime, Hannah disappeared into the staff room with her dented metal lunch tin. Inside sat vegetable soup she'd cooked 3 nights earlier and half a grilled cheese sandwich wrapped neatly in wax paper. Grace Mitchell, the library's volunteer coordinator, walked in carrying takeout. "You always bring soup." "It's economical." "It's also the healthiest thing anyone in this building eats." They laughed together. Grace admired Hannah for reasons Hannah never fully understood. What few people knew was that every Saturday morning, long before her paid shift began, Hannah organized a free reading circle for neighborhood children. No overtime, no extra pay, no recognition. Just books, hot chocolate donated by a local cafe, and children discovering worlds larger than the ones they had been born into. The program had quietly grown over 3 years. Some families walked nearly an hour to attend. One little boy once told Hannah, "Books are warm." She had never forgotten those 3 words. That evening, just before closing, Ethan arrived with Mrs. Alvarez. As always, he wandered directly toward the children's shelves. Without looking up from the book she was checking in, Hannah asked, "Did you remember what we talked about yesterday?" Ethan answered immediately, as though it were the most obvious truth in the world. "If something isn't yours, help it find its way home," Hannah finished. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them realized those simple words were about to be tested in a way neither could have imagined. Outside snow had begun falling again, heavier than before. By 6:40 that evening, the library had emptied. The last family bundled into heavy coats, the automatic doors slid shut, and silence settled over the building once more. Hannah turned off the reading lamps one row at a time, enjoying the familiar ritual. Every chair was pushed neatly beneath its table. Every returned book had found its place. She believed libraries deserved to greet the next morning with the same quiet dignity they offered every visitor. Grace zipped her coat beside the staff entrance. "They're saying another 6 inches tonight." Hannah glanced through the glass doors at the swirling snow. "I heard." "You sure you'll be okay getting home?" "I'll make the bus." Grace hesitated. "If you miss it, call me. You've already rescued me twice this month." Grace smiled. "I'll happily make it 3. Hannah laughed softly. "I know you would." They hugged briefly before heading in opposite directions. The air outside hit like a wall. The temperature had dropped below 10 degrees, and the wind swept loose snow across the sidewalks in ghostly waves. Streetlights reflected off the fresh powder, making the city appear almost peaceful despite the bitter cold. Hannah adjusted her scarf higher over her mouth and started walking toward the bus stop. The metal lunch tin swung gently from one hand. Her backpack rested heavily on her shoulders, filled with library paperwork she planned to finish after Ethan fell asleep. She checked the time. 6:47 p.m. If the bus stayed on schedule, she'd be home shortly after 7:30. Ethan would probably already be wearing his pajamas, pretending he hadn't started reading without her. The thought warmed her more than the coat did. As she reached a small neighborhood park bordering one of Minneapolis's frozen lakes, a faint sound stopped her. It was barely audible beneath the wind. A short bark, then another. Weak, uneven. She looked around. Nothing. The park appeared empty. She took another few steps. Again, a desperate whimper, this time closer. Hannah followed the sound toward a cluster of snow-covered bushes near the walking trail. "Breathe," she murmured to herself. She pushed aside heavy branches dusted with snow. At first she saw only white, then movement. A yellow Labrador struggled inside a shallow ditch where drifting snow had nearly buried its legs. One paw was tangled beneath a broken section of decorative fencing hidden beneath the snow. The dog's breathing came in frightened bursts. "It's okay," Hannah whispered immediately, kneeling despite the freezing ground. The Labrador flinched but didn't growl. Instead, dark brown eyes fixed on hers with desperate trust. "Oh, sweetheart." She carefully brushed snow away from the trapped paw. The metal wire had twisted around the dog's leg without cutting deeply. "Easy." Her gloves made it difficult to grip the frozen wire. She removed one glove despite the cold and worked with bare fingers until she finally bent the metal far enough. The dog pulled free. Instead of running away, it remained beside her, trembling violently. Hannah examined the injured paw. No blood, just swollen. "You've had a terrible day." The Labrador leaned gently against her knee. As she stroked its neck, her fingers brushed against something soft, a faded blue knitted scarf, wrapped neatly around the dog's collar. The wool was slightly frayed along one edge as though someone had repaired it years before instead of replacing it. Whoever owned this dog had cared enough to mend old things. That detail stayed with Hannah. She reached beneath the scarf until her fingers found a silver identification tag. The engraving was still readable despite the snow. Buddy. Below the name was an address. She stared at it. Maple Ridge Drive. Her heart sank. She knew the neighborhood. It wasn't nearby, not even close. She estimated the distance automatically. Almost 2 miles. Maybe a little more through this weather. She looked back toward the bus stop. A city bus rolled past in the distance. Its headlights disappeared behind falling snow. That had been hers. For a moment, she simply stood there. The wind pushed harder. Buddy sat beside her, lifting one paw from the frozen ground every few seconds. Hannah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. Only 32% battery remained. She dialed home. Mrs. Alvarez answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "Hi, is Ethan there?" "Right beside me." A moment later came Ethan's cheerful voice. "Hi, Mom." She smiled, despite everything. "Hey, buddy. Are you almost home?" There it was. The question she'd been afraid of. She looked down at Buddy. The Labrador gazed up at her with quiet patience, as though somehow understanding that an important decision rested in her hands. "I found someone's dog." There was a brief silence. "Is he okay?" "I think so." "Is he lost?" "Yes." Another pause. She could almost picture Ethan thinking. Then he asked the question she already knew was coming. "Do you know where he lives?" "Yes." "Can you take him home?" Hannah closed her eyes for a second. "It's pretty far." "Further than us?" "A little." Outside, the wind howled between apartment buildings. Snow continued falling thicker by the minute. Mrs. Alvarez gently took the phone. "Hannah," she said softly, "don't worry about Ethan. I'll stay as long as needed." "I don't want to inconvenience you." "You won't." Hannah swallowed. She knew it wasn't just about the time. It was the walk, the cold, the exhaustion, the risk of getting caught in worsening weather. She thanked Mrs. Alvarez before handing the phone back to Ethan. "Listen to me," she said. "I am." "What do we always say?" His answer came without hesitation. "If something isn't yours," she finished quietly, "help it find its way home." "Exactly." There was another small silence. Then Ethan said something that tightened her throat. "Mom?" "Yes." "If Buddy belongs to somebody, they're probably worried." Hannah looked down again. Buddy wagged his tail once. Just once, almost timidly. She laughed through a slow breath. "I think you're right." "I'll wait up?" "No." "You always say reading is better than worrying." "I did say that." "So I'll read." "You'll probably fall asleep." "Probably." "I love you." "I love you more." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The easiest choice would have been obvious. Animal control. Tomorrow morning. Someone else could handle it. No one would blame her. No one even knew she had found the dog. But every lesson she had ever tried to teach Ethan suddenly stood beside her in the snow, asking whether they were simply words, or something worth living by. Hannah tightened the strap of her backpack, adjusted her hat, picked up her lunch tin, then gently rested one hand on Buddy's neck. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's get you home." Buddy stood immediately. Together they turned away from the warm bus routes and began walking toward Maple Ridge Drive, disappearing deeper into the white winter night, with only the blue scarf visible against the endless snow. The farther they walked, the quieter the city became. Traffic thinned until only the occasional set of headlights glided through the snowfall before disappearing again. The sidewalks were almost empty now. Most people had already found warmth behind front doors, wrapped themselves in blankets, and forgotten what the streets felt like on a night like this. Hannah pulled her coat tighter. Her phone now read 7:16 p.m. Nearly 30 minutes had passed since she had left the park yet. According to the map she had memorized from Buddy's tag, they weren't even halfway there. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing icy flakes directly into her face. She lowered her head and kept moving. Beside her, Buddy limped only slightly. His injured paw seemed to bother him less now, but every so often he slowed to sniff the snow, as though searching for a familiar scent. "It's okay," Hannah whispered. "We'll get there." The Labrador glanced at her, his brown eyes calm despite the cold. Somehow he seemed to trust her completely. That trust made stopping impossible. They crossed a narrow pedestrian bridge overlooking the frozen creek that cut through the neighborhood. Beneath the snow, Hannah could hear water moving slowly beneath sheets of ice. The bridge was covered with a thin layer of packed snow. She placed one careful foot in front of the other. Halfway across, her right boot slipped. Her lunch tin flew from her hand. The metal container struck the railing with a sharp clang before landing several feet away. Hannah caught herself against the icy rail just before falling. For a brief second, she simply stood there, breathing hard. Her palms stung from scraping the frozen metal. Buddy hurried back toward her, pressing his nose gently against her gloved hand. "I'm okay," she assured him, though her heartbeat hadn't yet slowed. She retrieved the lunch tin. A small dent had appeared along one corner. She smiled faintly. "Looks like we're both collecting a few bruises tonight." The wind answered with another bitter gust. As they continued walking, the neighborhoods gradually changed. Small apartment buildings gave way to older family homes, decorated with winter wreaths and softly glowing porch lights. Through windows, Hannah caught brief glimpses of ordinary evenings. A father helping his daughter with homework, a family gathered around a dinner table, someone laughing at something on television, a grandmother knitting beside a fireplace. She wasn't jealous, only thoughtful. Everyone was carrying something invisible. Some burdens simply couldn't be seen from the sidewalk. Another block passed. Her socks had begun to feel damp. Each step pressed cold moisture deeper into her boots. She knew what that meant. Blisters tomorrow, if she was lucky. She checked the time again. 7:39 p.m. Her phone battery had dropped to 23%. Still enough. Hopefully. Buddy suddenly stopped walking. His ears lifted. He looked toward a nearby intersection. "What is it?" The dog sniffed the air before looking back at Hannah. Nothing appeared unusual. Perhaps he had caught a familiar scent. She scratched gently behind his ears. "We're close, aren't we?" His tail wagged once. She took that as a yes. As they resumed walking, Hannah's thoughts drifted unexpectedly to her father. David Bailey had never owned much. He worked for nearly 30 years repairing heating systems across Minnesota. His hands were always rough, his boots always worn, his truck always old. But whenever someone in the neighborhood lost power during a snowstorm, he somehow found time to help before driving home. One winter evening, when Hannah was about 12 years old, they had discovered an elderly man's groceries scattered across an icy parking lot. She remembered groaning. "Dad, we're already late." He had simply smiled. "We'll be later if nobody helps." Together they had picked up cans, apples, bread, and milk, while freezing rain soaked their jackets. On the drive home, Hannah had asked the question children often ask. "How come you always stop?" Her father had kept both hands on the steering wheel. "Because one day," he answered quietly, "we'll need somebody to stop for us." She had frowned. "But what if nobody does?" He smiled without looking away from the road. "That doesn't change who we choose to be." Those words had settled deep inside her. Years later, after cancer took him far too early, Hannah realized they had become part of the way she lived. Not because kindness guaranteed kindness in return, because character shouldn't depend on someone else's choices. The memory faded as Buddy barked softly. Ahead, a young man struggled to push his compact car out of a snowbank. Its tires spun helplessly. The driver waved apologetically. "You don't happen to have a shovel?" Hannah laughed. "I wish." He noticed Buddy. "Beautiful dog." "Not mine." She explained briefly that she was returning him home. The young man looked genuinely surprised. "In this weather?" She simply nodded. He stared for another moment before smiling. "I hope somebody does that for me someday." "So do I." They continued in opposite directions. Hannah noticed something. The young man had stopped trying to push his own car. Instead, he was watching them disappear down the sidewalk. Perhaps he was wondering why anyone would make such a difficult choice. Or perhaps he was remembering someone who once had. The snowfall intensified again. Large flakes drifted almost sideways now. Street signs became harder to read. The edges of sidewalks blurred into lawns beneath fresh layers of white. Hannah slowed, checking house numbers carefully. Buddy became more alert with every block. His pace quickened despite the injured paw. At one point, he pulled gently on the leash Hannah had fashioned from the strap of her scarf. "Easy," she laughed. "We're getting there." The Labrador looked back as though urging her to hurry. A few houses later, he suddenly froze. His ears stood straight. His entire body became still. Then, from somewhere far ahead, a porch light switched on. Buddy let out a sharp bark, unlike any he had made all evening. Hope. Pure hope. He surged forward with surprising energy. Hannah nearly lost her balance before tightening her grip. She followed his gaze. At the end of the snow-covered street stood a large, cedar-sided home with warm, golden light glowing through every window. A single pickup truck sat in the driveway. Fresh footprints covered the front porch as though someone had been outside searching repeatedly. Near the mailbox, barely visible beneath the falling snow, stood a man wearing only a sweater over his clothes. He wasn't shoveling. He wasn't checking the mail. He was staring into the darkness beyond the street, calling a name that the wind almost carried away. "Buddy!" The Labrador's tail began wagging so hard that his whole body shook. Hannah loosened her grip. "I think," she whispered with a tired smile, "we finally found your way home." The moment Buddy heard his name again, he bolted forward. "Hey!" Hannah called instinctively, though she already knew there was no stopping him. The Labrador bounded across the snow-covered lawn, his blue scarf fluttering behind him like a small flag against the endless white. The man near the mailbox turned sharply at the sound of paws pounding through the snow. For one heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Buddy leapt. The dog crashed joyfully into the man's chest, nearly knocking him backward. "Oh, Buddy!" The man's voice broke. He dropped to his knees without caring that the snow immediately soaked through his trousers. His gloved hand searched Buddy's face, ears, shoulders, as though needing to confirm that every part of him was truly there. "You scared me to death," Buddy answered with frantic tail wags and wet kisses across the man's cheeks. The porch light illuminated tears Hannah hadn't expected to see. This wasn't simply relief. This was someone who had believed he had already lost something irreplaceable. A few seconds later, the front door burst open again. An older woman wrapped in a heavy winter coat hurried outside. "Nathan." "I found him." "No," she gasped. She hurried across the porch. "Oh my goodness." She knelt beside Buddy, hugging him almost as tightly as Nathan had. The woman looked toward Hannah. "You brought him home?" Hannah nodded. "I found him near Lake Harriet." The woman covered her mouth. "We've been looking for hours." Nathan finally stood still, keeping one hand on Buddy's neck. Only now did he seem to truly notice the woman standing several yards away. Snow clung to Hannah's hat. Her boots were completely soaked. Her cheeks had turned crimson from the cold. The metal lunch tin hung quietly from her hand. He glanced toward the street behind her. There wasn't another person in sight. "You walked here." She smiled politely. "He couldn't exactly drive." Nathan laughed despite himself. Then his expression became serious. "How far?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure." The older woman answered after recognizing the location Hannah had mentioned. "From Lake Harriet." Nathan looked stunned. "That's almost 2 miles." Hannah gave a small shrug. He knew where he belonged. Buddy leaned gently against Nathan's leg. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the wind filled the silence. Nathan finally extended his hand. "I'm Nathan Carter. Hannah Bailey. It's an honor to meet you, Hannah." She shook his hand briefly. His grip was warm, despite the freezing night. Nathan noticed the faint redness across her bare fingertips, where her glove no longer covered one hand completely. "You took your glove off." "He was caught in some fencing." Nathan looked down at Buddy's paw. Only then did he notice the slight swelling. He was trapped. "A little." "You freed him." Hannah nodded once. The older woman looked at Hannah with quiet admiration. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "Nathan's aunt." "It's nice to meet you." Eleanor reached for Buddy's blue scarf. "I knitted this for him after—" She stopped herself. Nathan gently finished the sentence. "After my wife passed away." His voice was calm now. "It was her favorite color." Hannah looked at the scarf again, the careful stitches, the repaired edge. Suddenly it made sense. Someone had loved this dog enough to mend what was worn instead of replacing it. Nathan noticed her eyes resting on the scarf. "My wife, Claire, found Buddy at an animal shelter 8 years ago." He smiled sadly. "She used to joke that he rescued us more than we rescued him." Buddy nudged Nathan's hand again. Nathan scratched behind his ears automatically. "When Claire died during that blizzard 6 years ago," he stopped. The words caught in his throat. "He became the last piece of home I had left." Snow settled silently onto his shoulders. "I thought—" He looked away for a second. "I thought I'd lost him too." Hannah didn't search for perfect words. There weren't any. "I'm glad you didn't." Nathan looked back at her. "So am I." He reached into his coat pocket. "Please." He pulled out a leather wallet. "At least let me compensate you." Hannah immediately shook her head. "No, you walked 2 miles through this weather." "It was the right thing to do." "I insist." "You don't need to." Nathan removed several $100 bills. Hannah took one step backward. "I can't." "Why not?" she answered gently. "Because then it wouldn't feel like returning someone's family." Nathan froze. The bills remained in his hand. He slowly lowered them. Eleanor watched the exchange without saying a word. She seemed to understand both of them. Nathan slipped the wallet back into his pocket. "Then let me drive you home." Hannah smiled. "That's kind of you." "It's the least I can do." She glanced toward the quiet street. "I appreciate it." He walked toward the driveway. "My truck's right here." She remained where she was. "Nathan." He turned. "I'm going to say no." He looked genuinely confused. "It's freezing." "I know." "You've already walked all this way." "I know." "You'll have to walk back to the bus stop." "I know." He searched her face, trying to understand. "Were you afraid to accept help from a stranger?" She smiled softly. "Not exactly." "Then why—" Hannah looked down at the snow collecting around her boots. "When my son asks how Buddy got home," she paused, "I want to be able to tell him the story exactly as it happened." Nathan frowned slightly. She continued, "I taught him that kindness shouldn't come with expectations." The wind lifted the loose ends of Buddy's blue scarf. "If I accepted something because I expected it," she smiled again, "I'd be teaching him something different." Nathan stood completely still. He had spent years around business negotiations where every favor created another obligation. This sounded nothing like that world. "It wasn't expectation," he said quietly. "It was gratitude." "I know. And you still won't let me?" Hannah looked toward the dark street leading back into the storm. "Someone's waiting for me." "Ethan," she nodded. "He worries if I'm late." Nathan noticed something then. Despite her exhaustion, despite the cold, despite everything she had already done, The first thing she thought about was getting back to her son, not herself. He walked back toward her. "Will you at least promise me one thing?" She tilted her head. "If you ever need help." He hesitated. "Let someone know." Hannah smiled warmly. "I already do." He looked puzzled. "My neighbors help me." She glanced at Eleanor. "Tonight I helped Buddy." Then she looked back at Nathan. "Someday someone else will help another person." She adjusted the strap of her backpack onto her shoulder, picked up the dented lunch tin, pulled her scarf closer around her neck. "Good night." Before Nathan could think of another reason to stop her, Hannah turned and began walking back towards the snowy darkness. Neither hurried nor dramatic, just one determined step after another. Buddy made a small whimper and tried to follow. Nathan gently rested a hand on his collar. Together, he and Eleanor stood on the porch in complete silence, watching Hannah's figure grow smaller beneath the falling snow. Long after she disappeared beyond the next corner, Nathan remained exactly where he was. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, he had the unmistakable feeling that the remarkable part of this story wasn't that Hannah had returned his dog. It was that she had walked away without asking for anything at all. Nathan Carter slept less than 3 hours that night. Not because Buddy kept him awake. The Labrador was already stretched across the living room rug before midnight, exhausted from his unexpected adventure, occasionally twitching in his sleep, as if still running through deep snow. It was Hannah Bailey who wouldn't leave Nathan's thoughts. At 2:13 a.m., he stood alone in the kitchen with a mug of untouched coffee staring through the window where fresh snow continued falling beneath the porch light. Eleanor entered quietly, wrapping a wool robe tighter around herself. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. Nathan smiled faintly. "Have I?" "You have." She poured herself tea before leaning against the counter. "You're thinking about the young woman?" Nathan nodded. "I've met generous people." "So have I." "When?" "I've met honest people." "So have I." He looked toward the hallway where Buddy slept. "But I've never met someone who walked 2 miles in a blizzard, then refused both money and a ride home." Eleanor stirred her tea. "Perhaps that's why you can't stop thinking about her." Nathan didn't answer. Because she was right. He wasn't fascinated by what Hannah had done. He was unsettled by why she had done it. Most people expected something in return. Recognition. Compensation. At least a photograph. Hannah had accepted none of it, almost as if disappearing quietly mattered more than being remembered. The following morning, Buddy refused to leave the front door. Every few minutes, he wandered to the entrance, sniffed beneath it, then returned to the window overlooking the street. Nathan watched him from the dining room. "You think she's coming back?" Buddy's ears perked up. Nathan laughed softly. "I don't think so either." Still, he found himself looking toward the sidewalk each time someone passed. By Monday morning, life attempted to return to normal. Nathan arrived at Carter Urban Design, the architectural firm he had founded nearly 15 years earlier. The glass building overlooked downtown Minneapolis, its conference rooms filled with blueprints, development proposals, and meetings that stretched endlessly across his calendar. Normally, work consumed him completely. Today it didn't. During a presentation about a mixed-income housing project, Nathan caught himself staring absent-mindedly at the blue scarf folded across the back seat of his SUV. He had removed it from Buddy that morning to wash away the road salt and packed snow. Claire had knitted it herself years earlier. One loose stitch near the edge had always made her laugh. "It's imperfect," she used to say. "That's how you know someone actually made it." Nathan remembered Hannah studying that repaired corner. She had noticed it immediately. Most people wouldn't have. After the meeting ended, his assistant, Megan Foster, stepped into his office carrying a folder. "You've got lunch with the city council at 12. I'll reschedule." She blinked. You never reschedule. I know. You okay? Nathan hesitated. Megan. Yes. If someone wanted to thank a stranger who refused to be thanked. She smiled. That's oddly specific. What would you do? She considered it. I guess I'd respect what they wanted. Nathan leaned back in his chair. What if that doesn't feel like enough? Megan shrugged. Maybe it isn't about making yourself feel better. Her answer lingered long after she left. That afternoon, Nathan drove back to the neighborhood where he had first seen Hannah disappear into the storm. The sidewalks had finally been cleared. Children pulled sleds through front yards. Delivery trucks moved slowly along the streets. Everything looked ordinary. He parked near the small bridge Hannah must have crossed. The dent left by her lunch tin striking the railing was impossible to see, now hidden beneath fresh snow. Yet somehow he could picture the moment perfectly. He walked the route in reverse, imagining what those 2 miles had felt like after a full day's work. The wind, the darkness, the exhaustion. He stopped near the park where Buddy had become trapped. A city maintenance worker shoveled the walking path. Excuse me? Nathan called. The man looked up. Did you happen to see a woman walking with a Labrador here Saturday evening? The worker rested both hands on his shovel. I wasn't on shift. Nathan nodded. Thought I'd ask. You lose your dog. I found him again. The man smiled. Then somebody had a good heart. Nathan looked across the frozen lake. Yes. They did. He continued walking. Near the bus stop, a small coffee shop buzzed with afternoon customers escaping the cold. Nathan stepped inside. Warm air carrying the smell of roasted coffee wrapped around him immediately. A young barista greeted him. What can I get started? Nathan ordered black coffee before casually asking, Do you know a woman named Hannah Bailey? The barista frowned thoughtfully. Brown hair. Nathan nodded. Usually carries an old metal lunchbox. His eyes widened. Yes. I think she comes through here sometimes on her way to work. Do you know where she works? I'm pretty sure it's the public library. Nathan thanked her. That single piece of information should have satisfied his curiosity. Instead, it made him even more determined. Not because he wanted to repay Hannah. Something deeper had begun growing inside him. Respect, curiosity, perhaps even admiration. The next morning before heading to his office, Nathan parked across the street from the Minneapolis Public Library. He remained inside the truck. He had no intention of interrupting her work or introducing himself again. He simply wanted to know whether the person he remembered from that snowy night existed only in extraordinary circumstances, or whether kindness was simply how she lived. At 7:24 a.m., Hannah appeared. She stepped off a city bus carrying the same backpack, the same dented metal lunch tin, the same careful pace. She paused before entering the library. Not because she was late. An elderly man stood near the entrance, struggling to pull a small folding cart through packed snow. Without hesitation, Hannah set down her own belongings. She walked over. May I help? The man smiled gratefully. Together they lifted the cart over the icy curb. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. No one applauded. No one noticed. Except Nathan. He stayed in his truck another minute, watching Hannah disappear through the library doors. A slow realization settled over him. Returning Buddy hadn't been an extraordinary act for her. It had simply been another morning. In a life built from hundreds of small kindnesses that almost nobody ever saw. For the first time in years, Nathan canceled his first meeting of the day. Instead of driving to the office, he crossed the street and walked toward the library entrance. Not to repay a debt, but to learn who Hannah Bailey really was. Nathan hesitated outside the library's front entrance longer than he expected. Warm air drifted through the revolving door each time someone entered, carrying the familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and fresh coffee from the small cafe tucked inside the lobby. He couldn't remember the last time he had visited a public library without a meeting scheduled there. As a child, libraries had felt like safe places. As an adult, they had quietly become buildings he drove past. He stepped inside. The morning crowd had already begun to gather. College students spread laptops across long wooden tables. Parents helped toddlers choose brightly colored picture books. An elderly man carefully unfolded a newspaper beside the windows. No one seemed to be in a hurry. It was a different rhythm from the world Nathan lived in, a quieter one. He spotted Hannah almost immediately. She stood behind the circulation desk, helping a middle school boy whose backpack looked nearly as heavy as he was. "I think I lost one," the boy admitted nervously. "A library book." He nodded. "My dog chewed it." Hannah smiled instead of frowning. "Was it a good book?" He blinked. "Yeah? Then maybe your dog has excellent taste." The boy laughed in obvious relief. "We'll figure it out together." Nathan watched the tension disappear from the child's shoulders. No lecture, no embarrassment, just a solution. When the boy walked away, Hannah returned several books to a cart before noticing an elderly woman struggling with a stack of novels. Without being asked, Hannah walked around the desk. "Mrs. Donnelly let me carry those." "Oh, Hannah, they're not heavy." "I know. But they're heavy enough." The older woman smiled. "You always remember my name?" "I remember everyone's name." Nathan believed her. There was something remarkably natural about the way Hannah moved through the library. She wasn't performing kindness. She simply seemed unable to overlook people. He wandered deeper into the building, pretending to browse the history shelves while quietly observing. Near the children's section, colorful paper snowflakes decorated the walls. Several small tables had been arranged with crayons, construction paper, and stacks of books. Grace Mitchell knelt beside two volunteers arranging chairs. "Morning," Nathan said. Grace looked up. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "I was wondering what all this is." "Our reading Saturdays. For children." "And their parents?" Grace smiled proudly. "Mostly families who can't always afford activities during winter." Nathan glanced around. "Is this funded by the city?" Grace laughed softly. "I wish." "So how does it happen?" "Mostly because Hannah refuses to let it disappear." Nathan turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Grace stood and brushed paper scraps from her sweater. 3 years ago, one little boy came in after school every day because his apartment building had lost heat." Nathan listened quietly. "He'd sit over there with 3 jackets on, reading dinosaur books until closing." She pointed toward a corner by the windows. Hannah started reading with him. And then, other children joined. She smiled. 1 became 5. 5 became 12. Eventually, parents stayed. Now we usually have 30 or 40 people every Saturday." Nathan looked surprised. "The library pays for it." Grace shook her head. "Hannah brings homemade cookies. A neighborhood bakery donates leftovers. A coffee shop gives us hot chocolate. Volunteers read stories. Nobody gets paid." Nathan looked toward Hannah again. She was helping a little girl zip her backpack before handing her a chapter book. The child hugged Hannah around the waist before running towards the exit. Grace noticed where Nathan was looking. "She never tells people this." "What?" "Half the books those kids take home." Grace lowered her voice. The late fees disappear." Nathan frowned. "I thought libraries couldn't do that." "They can't." "So, Hannah pays them." He stared. "Out of her own paycheck." Grace nodded. $5 here. $3 there. Sometimes 15. Whatever a family can't afford. Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. Does Olivia know? The director suspects. But Hannah always says someone must have donated anonymously. Grace smiled knowingly. She protects people's dignity. Before Nathan could respond, voices filled the children's area. About 15 preschoolers entered holding colorful ropes connected to their teacher. Their excitement echoed through the room. Hannah immediately knelt to greet them. Who's ready for an adventure today? Every hand shot into the air. Nathan found himself smiling. He stayed longer than he intended. Nearly an hour passed before he realized he hadn't checked his phone once. That almost never happened. Later, he wandered toward the community room, where several cardboard boxes sat stacked against the wall. Each was labeled in neat handwriting, Winter Book Drive. A volunteer struggled to lift one. Before Nathan could offer help, Hannah was already there. Careful, she said. It's heavier than it looks. Together, they carried the box onto a folding table. The volunteer sighed. I don't know how you keep all this organized. Hannah laughed. I don't. You absolutely do. I just make lists. Nathan noticed the notebook sticking out of Hannah's bag. Its cover had been repaired several times with clear tape. The corners were bent, pages overflowed with handwritten notes. Another person might have replaced it years ago. Hannah simply kept writing. Again, he thought of Buddy's repaired blue scarf. Some people didn't throw away things that still had purpose. Perhaps they treated people the same way. Just before noon, Olivia Bennett emerged from her office carrying several folders. Hannah. Yes. Can we talk for a minute? Of course. Nathan stepped farther down the hallway, not intending to overhear. But Olivia's voice carried. I got the preliminary numbers. Hannah's smile faded slightly. They're cutting us again. Olivia nodded. I'm afraid so. How bad? The city wants another reduction next quarter. Hannah looked toward the children's room. What about Saturdays? Olivia hesitated. We're reviewing every community program. Silence settled between them. Nathan couldn't see Hannah's face clearly now, only the way her shoulders straightened as though preparing herself. Finally, she spoke. If the budget disappears... She took a slow breath. I'll keep coming. Olivia looked at her sadly. Hannah? I mean it. I'll volunteer. We'll read in the lobby if we have to. We'll read outside when spring comes. We'll figure something out. Olivia's eyes softened. You've already given more than anyone could ask. Hannah smiled gently. The children never asked for perfect. They just asked for stories. Nathan looked down at the polished wooden floor. He suddenly remembered his own mother bringing him to a library after school, because it was the only warm place they could stay until her evening shift ended. A librarian had once placed a mystery novel into his hands and said, "Take this one. I think you'll like the ending." She had been right. Nathan had forgotten her name decades ago, but he had never forgotten how she made a frightened little boy feel seen. Standing there now, he realized Hannah was becoming that person for dozens of children every single week, and almost no one outside these walls knew. As he quietly left the library that afternoon, one thought stayed with him more clearly than any blueprint waiting on his office desk. Some buildings changed a city, but people like Hannah Bailey changed the people who would someday build it. The following Thursday began with a silence that felt heavier than the snow outside. By 8:30 a.m., every member of the library staff had received the same email from Olivia Bennett asking them to gather in the community room before opening. No one said much as they carried their coffee mugs down the hallway. Budget meetings rarely brought good news. Hannah slipped into the chair near the back, a notebook balanced on her lap. She noticed Grace sitting unusually still, twisting a pen between her fingers. Olivia entered carrying a thick blue folder. She didn't smile. That alone told everyone enough. "Thank you for coming in early," she began. "I'll get straight to the point." She opened the folder slowly. "The city approved the revised operating budget last night?" Several employees exchanged anxious glances. "Our funding has been reduced by another 12%. The room fell silent. Someone quietly exhaled. Olivia continued. "We've managed to avoid layoffs." Relief appeared briefly across several faces, but there it was, the word everyone had expected. "We cannot continue every community program under the current budget." A librarian raised his hand. "Which programs?" Olivia hesitated. "We're still reviewing everything." Hannah already knew. She could feel it. Programs that generated revenue would survive. Programs built entirely on generosity rarely did. After the meeting ended, people drifted back toward their departments, speaking in low voices. Grace walked beside Hannah. "You okay?" Hannah nodded automatically. "I'm fine." "You don't sound convinced." "I've learned not to panic before there's a reason." Grace gave her a sympathetic smile. "I wish I were better at that." They reached the children's section. Tiny chairs waited neatly around colorful rugs where Reading Saturdays had welcomed dozens of families every weekend. Hannah ran one hand across the back of a chair, almost absent-mindedly, as though reassuring herself it was still there. By noon, Olivia asked Hannah to step into her office. The director closed the door gently behind them. "I wanted to tell you before rumors start." Hannah sat quietly. Olivia folded her hands. "The recommendation from the Budget Committee is to suspend Reading Saturdays beginning next month." The words landed softly, almost politely. Yet Hannah felt as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath her. "For how long?" "We don't know. Until funding improves." Hannah looked toward the window overlooking the snowy street. "And if funding never improves?" Olivia didn't answer immediately. "I honestly don't know." Silence filled the office. Not uncomfortable. Simply heartbreaking. Finally, Hannah spoke. "Can I ask why?" Olivia slid a document across the desk. "It isn't about whether the program matters." Hannah looked down. Attendance numbers, volunteer hours, operating costs, heating expenses, weekend staffing, insurance requirements, everything reduced to columns and calculations. "The committee says the program serves too few people compared to its cost." Hannah traced a finger across the page. "Did they visit?" Olivia frowned. "The committee?" "Yes." "No." "They reviewed reports." Hannah nodded slowly. "They've never seen 30 children sitting together reading one book." Olivia's expression softened. "No, they haven't. They've never watched parents borrow books because their children asked." "No, they haven't. They've never seen kids choosing stories instead of screens." Olivia looked away. "No." There wasn't anger in Hannah's voice, only sadness, the kind that comes when numbers speak louder than faces. "I understand," she said quietly. Olivia looked surprised. "You do?" "I understand budgets. I just wish budgets understood children." Neither woman spoke for several moments. Then Hannah closed the folder. "When does the announcement become public?" "Monday." She nodded once. "Then Saturday still happens?" Olivia smiled faintly. "Yes, it does." That afternoon, Hannah continued working exactly as she always had. She recommended novels, helped a veteran print insurance paperwork, read picture books to a little girl whose mother was interviewing for a job upstairs. No visitor would have guessed anything had changed. But Grace noticed. She knew Hannah well enough to recognize the tiny differences. The longer pauses, the distant look whenever she passed the community room, the way she lingered over each returned children's book. Near closing time, Ethan arrived carrying his backpack. He immediately sensed something was wrong. "You look tired." "I'm okay." He studied her face. "You say, 'I'm okay' differently when you're not." She smiled despite herself. "You've become too observant." "I learned from you." That evening after dinner, Hannah spread construction paper markers and Saturday's reading schedule across the kitchen table. Ethan looked confused. "I thought you were done planning." "So did I." She continued writing names. "Then why are you making more?" "Because until someone tells the children it isn't happening." She looked up at him. "It is." He nodded solemnly. "I'll help." Together they cut paper snowflakes while oatmeal cookies baked in the oven, the apartment filled with the warm scent of cinnamon. For a little while, the future didn't seem quite so frightening. Saturday morning arrived colder than expected. Families began appearing before 9. Some walked several blocks through fresh snow. Others came by bus. Several children rushed straight toward Hannah. "I finished the dragon book. I brought my little brother. Can we read the mystery today?" She greeted every child by name. Nathan arrived quietly a few minutes later. He hadn't planned to stay, only to return a book he had borrowed earlier that week. As he stepped into the children's area, he stopped. Nearly 40 people filled the room. Parents sat on folding chairs. Toddlers leaned against older siblings. Teenage volunteers poured hot chocolate into paper cups. Grace handed out homemade cookies. At the center sat Hannah, holding an illustrated book open across her lap. Every child watched her, completely captivated. Nathan remained near the doorway. He noticed something unusual. No expensive equipment, no elaborate decorations, no technology. Only books, conversation, patience, belonging. He quietly asked Grace, "How much does all this cost?" She gave a tired smile. "More than the city wants to spend." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace glanced toward Hannah before lowering her voice. "They're shutting us down." His expression changed instantly. "When? After today?" He looked back toward Hannah. She was laughing as a little boy proudly attempted different voices for the story's characters. No one around her seemed aware this might be the final Saturday. Nathan felt a heaviness settle over him. He had spent years approving budgets worth millions of dollars, yet here in a room full of children warmed by borrowed books and homemade cookies, he found himself wondering how anyone could calculate the value of hope on a spreadsheet. As the children applauded the end of the story, Hannah looked around the room with quiet gratitude. She smiled at every familiar face, determined that at least for today, not a single child would notice the heartbreak she carried behind that smile. Nathan remained in the back of the room long after the children burst into applause. He watched Hannah close the picture book and invite the youngest readers to choose one story each to borrow before going home. Instead of rushing them, she knelt beside every child, asking what had made them smile, what had frightened them, and which character they would have liked as a friend. She never hurried the answers. To anyone else, those conversations might have looked ordinary. Nathan recognized they were anything but. Children remembered adults who listened. That afternoon, after the last family had left Hannah and the volunteers folded chairs and wiped down tables, Grace gathered empty cookie trays while Ethan carefully stacked crayons into plastic containers sorted by color. Nathan quietly returned the book he had borrowed to the circulation desk before walking outside. He didn't want to interrupt. Not yet. He sat inside his truck for several minutes before starting the engine. Instead of driving toward downtown, he found himself taking the long route through the city. Every traffic light seemed to awaken another memory. By the time he reached the old North Side neighborhood where he had grown up, snow had begun falling again. The small duplex where he had spent most of his childhood was gone, now replaced by a newer apartment building. But the corner grocery store still stood. So did the narrow alley where he had learned to ride a bicycle. And 3 blocks away, the old Franklin Community Library. It had been renovated twice since his childhood, yet the front entrance looked almost exactly the same. Nathan parked across the street. For several minutes, he simply stared. When he was 9 years old, his mother had worked 2 jobs. During the winter months, she often finished her morning shift at a laundry service and still had 3 hours before reporting to a nursing home for the evening. They couldn't afford childcare. They couldn't afford after-school programs. So nearly every afternoon they walked to this library. Not because they loved books at first, because it was warm. He smiled faintly as another memory surfaced. One January afternoon, he had arrived wearing gloves with holes in both thumbs. His shoes leaked whenever snow melted. He had been embarrassed to sit near other children. A librarian named Mrs. Evelyn Harper had noticed without saying a word. The next week she handed him a mystery novel. "I think this one belongs with you," she had said. He remembered reading until the library closed, then borrowing another and another. Within months, he wasn't simply escaping the cold anymore. He was escaping the belief that poverty determined the size of his future. Books had quietly introduced him to architects, inventors, engineers, and dreamers he had never met in real life. Years later, he became one. Not because someone gave him money, because someone had given him imagination. Nathan stepped out of the truck. Snow crunched beneath his shoes as he walked toward the library entrance. The building was closed for the weekend, but the bronze plaque beside the door remained. He brushed away fresh snow with his glove. Dedicated to Evelyn Harper, whose belief in every child helped build a stronger Minneapolis. Nathan stood frozen. He had never noticed the plaque before. Or perhaps he had never looked. He laughed softly to himself. Of course. The woman who had changed hundreds of lives had probably never realized how many. Just like Hannah. He returned to his truck with a strange mixture of gratitude and regret. Gratitude for what one librarian had done decades earlier. Regret that he had spent years measuring success by projects completed instead of lives influenced. Monday morning arrived with another board meeting waiting at Carter Urban Design. Blueprints covered the conference table. Discussions centered around zoning approvals, construction timelines, and projected revenue. Nathan listened for nearly 20 minutes before closing his folder. "I have a question." The room fell silent. His financial director looked up. "Go ahead." "Why did we start this company?" Several executives exchanged puzzled glances. The question seemed almost philosophical. Finally, someone answered. "To design neighborhoods." Nathan nodded slowly. "That's what we build." He looked around the room. "But is that why we exist?" No one spoke. Nathan walked toward the large windows overlooking downtown. "When I founded this company, I said we weren't in the business of constructing buildings." He smiled faintly. "I said we were in the business of building communities." Several people nodded. He continued. "So tell me, if every project we complete makes beautiful streets but leaves fewer places where children can dream." He turned back towards the table. Have we actually built a community?" Silence answered him again. This time it felt different. Not confused, reflective. After the meeting, Megan caught up with him in the hallway. "You've been different lately." Nathan smiled. "Have I?" "You canceled 3 investor lunches. You visited a public library. You asked accounting how charitable partnerships work." She folded her arms. "And Buddy suddenly has his scarf back." Nathan looked down. Buddy's blue scarf had indeed returned to the back seat of his SUV after being washed and carefully repaired where one stitch had finally come loose. "I met someone." Megan raised an eyebrow. Nathan laughed. "Not like that." So who? A librarian. She waited. That's it. That's enough. She smiled knowingly. You admire her? Nathan considered the word. Admire, respect, perhaps even envy. Not her circumstances. Her clarity. She seemed to know exactly what mattered every single day. Before leaving the office that evening, Nathan asked Megan one final question. Can you find out how public libraries receive private grants? She looked surprised. For one project. I'm not sure yet. Then why? Nathan picked up his coat. Because I don't want to rescue someone. He paused before opening the door. I want to protect something that's already changing lives. Outside, snowflakes drifted quietly across the city once again. Miles away, Hannah was shelving returned books, unaware that the conversation taking place inside a downtown office had nothing to do with profits anymore. For the first time in many years, Nathan Carter wasn't searching for the next building worth investing in. He was searching for the right way to invest in a person who had never once asked him for anything. Nathan spent the next week asking questions no one in his company expected. Instead of reviewing construction bids during his lunch breaks, he spoke with nonprofit advisors, city officials, and attorneys who specialized in community partnerships. Every conversation began the same way. I want to support a public library program. And every conversation eventually reached the same question. What would you like the program named? Nathan always gave the same answer. It already has a name. The advisors looked puzzled. It's called Reading Saturdays. No donor recognition, no. A commemorative plaque? No. A press conference? Nathan smiled politely. Absolutely not. One consultant finally laughed. You're making this unusually difficult. I hope so. He wasn't interested in generosity that depended on applause. The more he thought about Hannah walking away through the snow, the more he understood that the greatest acts of kindness often happened without witnesses. He wanted whatever came next to honor that spirit. 3 days later, Nathan requested a meeting with the Board of Trustees overseeing the Minneapolis Public Library Foundation. The conference room overlooked the Mississippi River, its long windows framing another gray winter afternoon. 6 board members sat around the polished oak table. Among them was Olivia Bennett. She recognized Nathan immediately. Mr. Carter. Miss Bennett. She wondered why a well-known developer wanted to discuss a neighborhood library. After brief introductions, Nathan opened a simple folder. I'd like to establish a long-term community literacy fund. One trustee leaned forward. For how much? Nathan named the figure. The room fell completely silent. It wasn't a fortune by corporate standards, but it was more than enough to sustain Reading Saturdays for years while expanding children's programming across several neighborhoods. Olivia looked down at the proposal again, certain she had misread it. This would cover staffing materials, volunteer training, and transportation assistance, Nathan added. So families without reliable transportation can still attend. Another trustee adjusted his glasses. What naming rights are you requesting? None. The fund could carry your company's name. I don't want it to. We could dedicate a reading room. No, a board member frowned slightly. Mr. Carter donors usually prefer some public acknowledgement. Nathan shook his head. The children don't need another name on a wall. They need stories. Olivia studied him carefully. She had spent years meeting donors. Most wanted photographs, recognition dinners, media coverage. Nathan wanted none of it. She finally asked the question that mattered. Why this program? Nathan hesitated. Then he answered honestly. Because someone reminded me what libraries actually do. He offered nothing more. He didn't mention Hannah. He didn't mention Buddy. He didn't mention the blizzard. Some stories belonged to the people who had lived them. The legal details took another 2 weeks. Attorneys reviewed documents. Financial officers finalized endowment terms. The foundation carefully structured the gift so that annual earnings, not the principal itself, would permanently support community literacy programs. Nathan insisted on one additional condition. All hiring decisions, promotions, and program leadership would remain entirely under the library's authority. No special treatment, he said. No positions promised. No interference. I want to fund opportunity, not control it. The foundation unanimously agreed. The following Monday morning, Olivia received official confirmation. Reading Saturdays would not only continue, it would expand. She closed her office door before allowing herself to cry. Not because money had arrived, because hope had. That afternoon, she called Grace into her office. "I've got good news." Grace listened in disbelief as Olivia explained the new funding. "You're serious?" Olivia nodded. "We're saved." Grace laughed, then covered her face with both hands. I thought we'd have to tell the children." "So did I." "What changed?" Olivia smiled. "A donor." "Who?" "They requested complete anonymity." Grace looked toward the children's section. "Hannah's going to be so happy." When Hannah entered a few minutes later, she immediately sensed something different. Grace was smiling too broadly. Olivia looked strangely relieved. "What happened?" Olivia handed her a letter. Hannah read silently, then read it again. The words almost didn't seem real. Funding secured, reading Saturdays renewed, expanded literacy initiatives approved, community outreach preserved. She slowly lowered the paper. "I don't understand." "Neither do we," Grace admitted with a laugh. "The donor wishes to remain anonymous." Hannah looked at Olivia. "Did they say why?" "They only wrote one sentence." Olivia opened the original letter and read aloud. "Every child deserves a warm place to discover who they might become." Silence settled over the office. Hannah swallowed hard. Those words reached somewhere deep inside her. She thought of children reading beside heaters on cold afternoons, parents borrowing books they couldn't afford to buy, Ethan discovering entire worlds through library shelves. Whoever had written that sentence understood. Not libraries, children. "Can I write a thank you letter?" Hannah asked. Olivia smiled gently. "You can." "But we have nowhere to send it." Hannah looked down again at the letter in her hands. Then she smiled. "Maybe that's okay." Grace tilted her head. "Why?" "Because sometimes—" Hannah folded the paper carefully. "Gratitude doesn't need an address." Later that evening, Reading Saturdays continued exactly as before. Parents arrived carrying toddlers bundled in oversized coats. Teenagers volunteered to read aloud. The bakery delivered boxes of cinnamon rolls. Children scattered happily among colorful bookshelves. Nothing looked different, yet everything had changed. Across town, Nathan sat in his office finishing paperwork long after sunset. Buddy slept peacefully beneath the window, his blue scarf freshly washed and loosely draped around his neck. Megan stepped into the office carrying one last folder. "The foundation accepted everything." Nathan nodded. "Good. They're calling it one of the largest literacy gifts the city has received in years." He simply smiled. She looked at him curiously. "You still don't want anyone to know?" "No." "Not even her." Nathan glanced toward Buddy. "Especially not her." Megan laughed softly. "I don't think I've ever met anyone who worked this hard to stay anonymous." Nathan closed the folder. "I learned something recently." "What?" "The best way to thank someone who protects another person's dignity." He looked out at the snow falling beyond the glass. "Is to protect theirs." Miles away, Hannah locked the library doors after another joyful evening. She paused before switching off the final light in the children's room. The shelves stood full. The chairs remained waiting. The stories would continue. She whispered a quiet "thank you" into the empty room, not knowing that the person she wished to thank was looking at the same snowfall from another part of the city, equally grateful that she would never know his name. At least, not yet. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Minneapolis. The piles of snow along the sidewalks shrank day by day, revealing patches of brown grass and forgotten bicycle racks beneath them. Children traded thick mittens for lighter jackets, and the first robins returned to the neighborhood parks, as if announcing that another season had quietly survived. Inside the library, Reading Saturdays had become busier than ever. Families from neighboring districts had begun attending after hearing about the expanded program. New volunteers arrived every week. A retired English teacher started a creative writing circle. A local college student organized science story hours. The coffee shop across the street now donated enough hot chocolate for everyone. Hannah welcomed each new idea with the same humble response. "This belongs to the community." She never spoke as though she had built it. She spoke as though she had merely opened the first door. One Tuesday morning, Olivia Bennett walked through the children's section carrying a folder marked Personnel. "Hannah, do you have a minute?" "Of course." They stepped into Olivia's office. Olivia placed the folder on her desk before taking a seat. "You've probably noticed how much the literacy programs have grown." Hannah smiled. "It's wonderful to see." "It is." Olivia folded her hands. "And that's exactly why I wanted to speak with you." Hannah waited quietly. "The board has approved creating a new full-time position." "What kind of position?" "Community Literacy Coordinator." Hannah nodded slowly. It would oversee Reading Saturday's school partnerships, outreach programs, volunteer training, and neighborhood literacy events. "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity." "It is." Olivia smiled. "I think you should apply." For a brief moment, Hannah said nothing. She honestly believed Olivia was speaking about someone else. "Me? Yes. I've never managed a department." "You already manage one." "I don't have the title." "You've been doing the work for years." Hannah looked down at the folder. "I'm not sure I'm qualified." Olivia laughed softly. "Do you know what impressed the board most?" Hannah shook her head. "It wasn't attendance numbers. It wasn't donations. It wasn't expansion. It was the fact that every volunteer we interviewed said exactly the same thing." "What did they say?" "They said the program succeeds because people feel seen." The words settled gently between them. Olivia continued. "You can't teach that in management classes?" Hannah looked uncertain. "There will be applicants with better resumes." "There probably will." "They'll have more experience." "Perhaps." "They may even have graduate degrees." Olivia nodded. "Some probably will." "Then why me?" "Because resumes explain where people have worked." She smiled warmly. "They don't explain how people make others feel." Hannah left the office carrying the application packet, but feeling no closer to a decision. That evening after dinner, Ethan noticed the folder sitting unopened on the kitchen table. "Homework," she laughed. "I wish." He pulled out a chair. "What is it?" She explained the new position. Ethan listened carefully. "Are you going to do it?" "I don't know." "Why?" She hesitated. "What if someone else is better?" Ethan frowned. "Better at reading," she smiled. "No, better at leading." He thought for several seconds before answering. "Mom." "Yeah." "Every Saturday when new kids come, they always look scared. They don't stay scared." "No. They smile." She nodded. "They do." "Isn't that leading?" Hannah blinked. Children had a remarkable ability to simplify questions adults complicated. The next morning, she still hadn't completed the application. Instead, she tucked it into her backpack and went to work. Around lunchtime, Grace found her reorganizing donated books. "You've been avoiding paperwork." Hannah looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" Grace pointed toward the folder sticking out of her bag. "Because it's still there." Hannah sighed. "I don't know if I should apply." Grace folded her arms. "I've been waiting for you to say that." "You have. I know exactly what you're thinking." "You do? Someone else deserves it more." Hannah smiled sheepishly. "Was I that obvious?" Grace nodded. "Hannah, do you remember my first day here?" "Barely." "I was terrified." "You introduced yourself to every volunteer before introducing yourself to me." Hannah laughed. "I did." "You said volunteers should never feel invisible." Grace's expression softened. "You've spent years helping everyone else believe they belong. It's about time you believed it too." The words stayed with Hannah throughout the afternoon. 2 days later, applications officially closed. The position attracted candidates from across the city: former school administrators, youth program directors, nonprofit managers, people with impressive credentials. Hannah almost withdrew hers twice before finally submitting it 5 minutes before the deadline. Across town, Nathan received an email from a member of the Library Foundation. The subject line read, "Community Literacy Coordinator Search Committee." He opened it. The foundation had been invited to recommend potential candidates based on their involvement with literacy initiatives. A list of applicants appeared below. Halfway down, Hannah Bailey. Nathan smiled quietly. Megan happened to walk into his office carrying construction reports. "You look pleased." "I am." "What happened?" He turned the monitor slightly. "They're hiring someone to lead the literacy programs." She glanced at the screen. "Do you know any of the candidates?" "One." "You'll recommend her?" Nathan considered the question carefully. "No." Megan looked confused. "I thought you admired her." "I do." "Then why not?" "Because admiration shouldn't replace fairness." He closed the laptop. "If she earns that position, it should be because she deserves it. And if someone asks about her, I'll tell the truth. No more." The interview committee met the following week. Each candidate received identical questions, identical time limits, identical evaluation forms. Nathan attended only as an observer representing the foundation's literacy initiative. He insisted beforehand that he would not score applicants. He would not vote. He would not influence the committee. Olivia appreciated that more than she expected. When Hannah's turn finally arrived, she walked into the conference room carrying the same taped notebook Nathan had seen months earlier. No expensive portfolio, no polished presentation binder, just years of handwritten notes. She greeted everyone with a calm smile before taking her seat. Nathan noticed something immediately. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply prepared. As the committee chair asked the first question, Nathan folded his hands quietly in his lap. For the first time since the snowy night Buddy had found his way home, there was nothing he could do to help Hannah. And strangely, that was exactly how he believed it should be. Hannah took a slow breath before the first interview question was asked. The conference room felt smaller than it really was. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking downtown Minneapolis, falling across a polished wooden table where 6 committee members sat with notepads open. Nathan occupied the chair nearest the end of the table. As promised, he had no scoring sheet, only a notebook that remained closed. The committee chair smiled warmly. "Miss Bailey, thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me." The first questions were expected. Describe your experience. How would you organize volunteers? How would you measure success? Hannah answered honestly. She never exaggerated. When she didn't know something, she simply admitted it. "I haven't managed a department this size," she said at one point. "But I've learned that people volunteer longer when they feel appreciated than when they feel supervised." One committee member looked up from his notes. "Can you explain that?" "I write handwritten thank you notes." "You write them yourself?" "Every month. To every volunteer. As many as I can." "Why?" Hannah smiled. "Because everyone deserves to know they mattered." Pens continued moving across paper. Another interviewer asked, "Suppose funding becomes limited again. Which programs would you cut first?" Hannah paused. It was the hardest question so far. "I'd begin by asking a different question." The committee waited. "What problem are we actually trying to solve?" The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "If the problem is money..." She folded her hands calmly. "There are many solutions besides ending programs. Partnerships. Volunteers. Shared spaces. Community donations." She looked around the table. "But if we cut the program before asking the community whether they'd help, we're assuming people don't care." "And I don't believe that's true." Nathan looked down for a moment. Those words sounded remarkably familiar. Not because he had heard them before, because he had seen them lived. The interview continued for nearly 45 minutes. Near the end, one committee member asked a question none of the previous candidates had received. "What accomplishment makes you proudest?" Hannah didn't answer immediately. She thought carefully. Finally, she smiled. "There's a little boy named Marcus." The room became quiet. "He came to Reading Saturdays because his grandmother worked weekends. He hated reading. He told me books were boring." Several committee members smiled. "So what changed?" "I discovered he loved fixing bicycles." She laughed softly. "So I found books about bicycles. Then motorcycles. Then engineering." She looked down briefly. "Last month he told me he wants to become a mechanical engineer. That's my proudest accomplishment. Not because he likes books now, but because he discovered he could love learning." No one spoke for several seconds. The interview chair finally smiled. "Thank you, Miss Bailey." As Hannah gathered her notebook, Nathan noticed the tape holding its spine together had begun peeling away again. She still hadn't replaced it. Outside the conference room, Hannah exhaled deeply. She wasn't sure how she had done, only that she had answered truthfully. That evening, she returned home feeling emotionally exhausted. Ethan looked up from the kitchen table where he was finishing homework. "How'd it go?" She shrugged. "I honestly don't know." "Were you nervous?" "Very." "Did you tell the truth?" "Yes." He grinned. "Then you already won?" She laughed. "I wish job interviews worked like that." "They should." Meanwhile, inside the conference room, committee members reviewed their notes. One by one, candidates were discussed. Education, experience, leadership, budget knowledge, communication. Finally, Olivia asked quietly, "Any thoughts about Hannah Bailey?" An older committee member adjusted his glasses. "She's not the most experienced candidate." "No. But she's the only one who answered every question by talking about people instead of programs." Another member nodded. "I noticed that too." The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Nathan remained silent, exactly as he had promised. When someone finally turned toward him, he looked slightly surprised. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "You've observed all the interviews. We're not asking you to vote, but we'd value your perspective." Nathan chose his words carefully. "I won't recommend a candidate, but I will answer factual questions." The chair nodded. "Fair enough." "You've visited Reading Saturdays, correct?" "I have." "Is Miss Bailey's description accurate? Nathan answered without hesitation. If anything, he smiled faintly. She understated it. Nothing more, nothing less. The committee returned to deliberations. 2 days later, Hannah received an email asking her to return to the library director's office Friday afternoon. She assumed additional paperwork was needed. Instead, she found Olivia waiting beside the window, with Grace standing nearby. Both women were smiling. Hannah immediately became suspicious. What happened? Olivia didn't answer right away. She picked up a sealed envelope from her desk. I've been waiting all week to give you this. Hannah accepted it carefully. Her hands suddenly felt colder than they should have. She opened the envelope, read the first sentence, then the second. She stopped, read them again. Grace could no longer contain herself. Well, Hannah looked up slowly. Her voice disappeared. Olivia stepped forward. Congratulations. You are officially our new community literacy coordinator. For several long seconds, Hannah simply stared. She laughed through gathering tears. I don't know what to say. Grace hugged her first. You say yes? Olivia smiled. You earned this. Hannah shook her head gently. So many people helped. They did, Olivia nodded. But they couldn't have done your work for you. Later that afternoon, after signing the necessary paperwork, Hannah walked through the children's section. Nothing looked different. The same shelves, the same chairs, the same reading rug. Yet somehow everything felt new. She wasn't thinking about a promotion. She was thinking about responsibility. More families, more volunteers, more children who needed someone to believe in them. As she reached the front entrance, she noticed someone standing beside the outdoor book return. Nathan. Buddy sat calmly beside him wearing the familiar blue knitted scarf. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Buddy recognized her. His tail began wagging wildly. Hannah laughed as he trotted happily toward her. Well, hello there. She knelt to scratch behind his ears. I've missed you too. Nathan smiled. I think he remembers exactly who brought him home. Hannah stood. It's good to see both of you. You too? He glanced towards the folder in her hands. I heard the library made a wise decision. She looked surprised. You knew. The foundation announced it this morning. She smiled modestly. I'm still trying to believe it. Nathan nodded. I hope you do. She looked at him curiously. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you the anonymous donor? Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he answered honestly. I helped. Hannah studied his face. You saved Reading Saturdays. He gently shook his head. No. You did. I only made sure it had the chance to continue. He looked toward the library windows where children were already gathering for the afternoon. You built it. His voice remained calm. I didn't give you a future, Hannah. You built one. She felt tears gathering again, not because he had helped, but because he had never once tried to make her feel indebted. Buddy leaned gently against both of them, the faded blue scarf catching the soft spring breeze. For the first time since that snowy night, Hannah understood why Nathan had remained anonymous. He hadn't wanted gratitude, he had wanted dignity, and somehow that gift meant even more than the funding itself. Spring settled gently over Minneapolis. The last traces of snow disappeared beneath fresh green grass, and the trees lining the neighborhood streets filled with new leaves. Children who had spent months wrapped in heavy winter coats now raced through parks in bright t-shirts, their laughter drifting through open library windows. For Hannah Bailey, the change of season brought something else. Responsibility. Her first official day as community literacy coordinator began before sunrise, just as most of her workdays always had. She still arrived at the library before anyone else. Some habits didn't need promotions. She unlocked the children's room, switched on the reading lamps one by one, and paused for a moment in the doorway. The room looked exactly the same, yet it somehow felt larger. Not because the walls had changed, because the possibilities had. By 8 o'clock, her calendar was already full. A meeting with elementary school principals, a volunteer orientation, planning sessions with neighborhood shelters, a book donation arriving after lunch, an evening literacy workshop for parents. Grace peeked into Hannah's office carrying 2 coffee cups. "I figured you'd forget breakfast." Hannah smiled. "I almost did." Grace placed a cup on the desk. "You know." "What?" "You still haven't unpacked." Hannah looked around. Her office contained only a small bookshelf, a family photograph of herself and Ethan, and the same worn notebook repaired once again with fresh, transparent tape. "I guess I brought everything I needed," Grace laughed. "You brought that notebook." "I've had it for 6 years. You know I could buy you a new one." "I know." "So why don't you let me—" Hannah gently closed the notebook. "Because every page reminds me where we started." Grace smiled knowingly. "You really don't throw important things away." "Neither should libraries." A week later, Hannah stood inside Lincoln Elementary School, introducing the new Neighborhood Reading Partnership. Teachers, volunteers, and parents filled the cafeteria. She explained how books would now be delivered every Friday to families unable to visit the library regularly. A father raised his hand. "What if we lose a book?" Hannah smiled. "Then we'll find another one." A mother looked surprised. "No late fees. We care more about children reading than perfect records." Several parents exchanged relieved glances. Nathan happened to be visiting the school that same afternoon for an unrelated community redevelopment meeting. As he walked through the hallway, he heard children's laughter coming from the cafeteria. Curious, he stepped quietly inside. Hannah stood surrounded by families kneeling beside a little girl choosing her first library card. The child held the card carefully between both hands. "Is this really mine?" "It is." "I don't have to give it back," Hannah laughed. "No. But you do have to bring the books back." The girl nodded seriously. "I can do that." Nathan remained unnoticed near the doorway. Watching Hannah never felt repetitive. Every encounter revealed another reason people trusted her. She somehow made every person feel like the most important one in the room. Weeks passed. Reading Saturdays expanded again. Volunteers now visited senior centers where grandparents read stories alongside elementary students. A local bookstore donated hundreds of gently used books. Teenagers who had once attended the program as children returned to help younger readers. One Saturday morning, Hannah looked around the crowded community room and barely recognized how much it had grown. More than 60 people had gathered. The room buzzed with conversation. Parents exchanged recipes. Children recommended books to each other. Retirees taught knitting between reading sessions. The library no longer felt like a building. It felt like a neighborhood. Nathan occasionally stopped by with Buddy, never announced, never expecting attention. He usually left a sealed box of books at the donation table before quietly slipping away. The volunteer coordinator always found a simple note taped inside. "For whoever needs these next." No signature. Grace eventually figured out who the anonymous donor was. She never mentioned it. She understood why. One afternoon, Hannah found Ethan sitting beside Marcus, the same boy who had once hated reading. Now 12 years old, Marcus spread mechanical drawings across a table while explaining bicycle gears to several younger children. "I made these." Ethan looked impressed. "You're really good." Marcus grinned. "I'm saving for engineering camp." After Marcus left, Hannah quietly asked Ethan, "Remember when he wouldn't even open a book?" Ethan nodded. "I remember." What changed? He smiled. Somebody found the right story. Hannah looked across the room. Maybe that was true of people, too. Sometimes lives changed, not because someone rescued them, but because someone believed there was still another chapter waiting. Later that evening, Nathan waited outside the library with Buddy. As Hannah locked the doors, Buddy trotted happily toward her. She scratched behind his ears. "I think he still believes you work here just for him." Nathan laughed. "I've stopped arguing." They began walking slowly towards the parking lot. The spring air felt warm compared to the winter night that had first brought them together. Nathan looked around. "I've been meaning to tell you something." Hannah glanced at him. "What is it?" "I visited the library where I grew up." She smiled. "The one you told me about?" He nodded. "I found a plaque." He told her about Evelyn Harper, the librarian who had quietly changed his childhood without ever realizing it. When he finished, Hannah remained silent for a few moments. Finally, she asked, "Do you think she knew?" "Knew what?" "How many lives she changed?" Nathan smiled thoughtfully. "I doubt it." They continued walking. "I think that's the remarkable part." "What is?" "The people who make the biggest difference." He looked toward the library entrance, where children were still laughing inside after an evening program. "Usually don't know how many hearts they leave fingerprints on." Hannah looked back at the building, then at Buddy, then at the children running toward waiting parents. She realized something. The snowy walk that had begun with one lost dog had never really been about Buddy. It had been about finding people. People who still believed that quiet acts of kindness mattered. People willing to carry hope farther than anyone expected. And now, there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The circle had already grown larger than either she or Nathan had ever imagined. The first snowfall of the following winter arrived earlier than expected. By late afternoon, thick white flakes drifted quietly across Minneapolis, covering sidewalks, rooftops, and park benches with a fresh blanket of snow. The city seemed to move more slowly, as though everyone instinctively respected the silence that accompanied the season's first storm. Inside the library, children pressed their noses against the windows between story sessions. "It's snowing. We're going to build a snow fort. I hope school gets canceled." Their excitement filled the building with laughter. Hannah smiled as she watched them gather backpacks and wave goodbye. She remembered another snowy evening almost a year earlier. One decision, one lost dog, one long walk. Sometimes the smallest choices quietly redirected an entire life. By 5 o'clock, the library had emptied. Grace locked the volunteer supply cabinet. "Drive safely." Hannah laughed. "You still forget I don't have a car." Grace rolled her eyes. "One day you're going to let someone convince you to buy another one." "Maybe." "You've been saying maybe for almost a year." Hannah pulled on her coat. "I know." Outside, Ethan waited beneath the awning, now taller than he had been the previous winter. At 9 years old, he insisted on carrying both his own backpack and his mother's dented lunch tin. "I've got it," he said proudly. "I can see that." They started the familiar walk toward the bus stop. Snowflakes landed on Ethan's knit hat before melting almost immediately. He looked up. "Do you think Buddy likes snow?" Hannah smiled. "I think Buddy believes snow was invented specifically for dogs." Ethan laughed. Halfway through Riverside Park, a faint cry drifted across the wind. It wasn't loud, but Hannah stopped walking instantly. Ethan noticed. "You heard it too." She nodded. Again came the sound, soft, worried, somewhere near the walking trail. Without exchanging another word, mother and son followed the voice through the lightly falling snow. Near a wooden bench stood a little girl, wearing a bright yellow coat, much too thin for the weather. She hugged a small black and white terrier against her chest. Tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. The puppy trembled almost as much as she did. Hannah approached slowly. "Hi there." The little girl looked up nervously. "Are you okay?" She sniffled. "I found him." "The puppy?" She nodded. "I don't know where he lives." Hannah knelt until they were at eye level. "What's your name?" "Lucy." "How old are you, Lucy?" "9. Ethan smiled. "I'm 9 too." Lucy looked at him with cautious curiosity. "I was taking piano lessons," she explained. "Then I saw him running. He almost got hit by a car." She hugged the puppy tighter. "I couldn't leave him." Hannah glanced toward the puppy's collar. There was no identification tag, only a worn red collar. "No phone number." Lucy shook her head. "I already looked." Ethan looked at his mother. Neither of them needed to say anything. He already knew. Hannah smiled gently. "I guess we're helping someone find home tonight." Lucy looked uncertain. "Will we?" "We'll try." The three of them carried the puppy toward the nearby community center, where lost pets were often reported during winter storms. As they walked, Hannah noticed Lucy shivering. The little girl's gloves were damp. Her thin scarf barely covered her neck. "Weren't you expecting snow today?" Hannah asked. "My grandma said it wasn't supposed to start until later." "It surprised everyone." Lucy nodded. "I'm okay." But she wasn't. Her lips had begun turning pale. Hannah looked at Ethan. Without hesitation, he understood. He quietly removed his own extra pair of knit gloves from his backpack. "Here." Lucy looked surprised. "But then you'll be cold." "I've still got one pair." She hesitated. "I can't." "You can," he smiled. "My mom says warm hands make brave decisions." Lucy accepted them with a quiet thank you. A few more blocks later, the wind grew stronger. Snow blew directly across the sidewalk. Hannah noticed Lucy beginning to shiver again. Almost automatically, her eyes drifted toward the blue knitted scarf wrapped around her own neck. Not just any scarf, Buddy's scarf. Months earlier, Eleanor had quietly insisted Hannah keep it after knitting Buddy a new winter scarf. "Claire always believed warmth should keep traveling," Eleanor had said. Hannah had protested. "It belongs to Buddy." Eleanor had smiled. "It belonged to kindness first." Since then, Hannah wore it every winter. She stopped walking. Lucy looked back. What happened? Hannah slowly untied the soft blue scarf from around her neck. Its familiar repaired corner brushed gently across her fingers. For just a moment, she remembered the freezing night Buddy had worn it home. Then she wrapped it carefully around Lucy's shoulders. The little girl immediately shook her head. "No. You need it. I'll be all right. But it's warmer on you." Lucy touched the scarf carefully. "It smells like cinnamon." Hannah laughed. "Probably because my son leaves cookies everywhere." Ethan grinned. "I do not." "You absolutely do." Lucy smiled for the first time since they had met. At that exact moment, a familiar voice called from across the park. "Hannah!" They turned. Nathan stood near the parking lot holding Buddy's leash. The Labrador bounded happily toward them. His new navy scarf bounced with every joyful step. Buddy stopped directly in front of Lucy, sniffed the blue scarf around her neck, then wagged his tail enthusiastically, as though recognizing an old friend. Nathan approached, smiling warmly. "I had a feeling I'd find you helping somebody." Hannah laughed softly. "It seems to happen?" He looked at Lucy. "Everything okay?" Lucy explained about finding the puppy. Nathan listened quietly before pulling out his phone. "I know someone at the city's animal shelter. Let's see if anyone's been looking for this little guy." Within minutes, they learned a family had already reported the missing puppy only a few neighborhoods away. Lucy clapped happily. "We found them!" Nathan looked from Hannah to Ethan, to the blue scarf resting around Lucy's shoulders. He recognized it immediately. He didn't say a word. He simply smiled, because he finally understood something Eleanor had meant all those months ago. Claire's warmth hadn't disappeared. Buddy had carried it. Then Hannah. Now Lucy. Kindness like that old blue scarf had simply found another pair of shoulders that needed it. And somewhere beyond the falling snow, another circle had quietly begun. The drive to the city animal shelter took less than 15 minutes. Lucy sat in the back seat beside Ethan, carefully cradling the little terrier in her lap, as though he were made of glass. Buddy rested on the floor between Nathan's feet, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the tiny newcomer before settling back down with quiet approval. Outside, snow continued falling, softening the streets beneath a blanket of white. Inside the truck, warmth slowly returned to everyone's hands. When they arrived, a shelter employee hurried toward them before the doors had fully opened. "You found him?" Lucy nodded excitedly. "We did." The woman looked at the puppy and smiled with obvious relief. "His name is Pepper." She checked the collar once more before speaking into her radio. "They're here. Tell the family he's safe." Only a few minutes later, the front entrance burst open. A young couple rushed inside with 2 small children. The little boy couldn't have been older than 6. The moment he saw Pepper, he cried out joyfully. "Pepper!" The terrier wriggled free from Lucy's arms and ran across the floor, jumping into the boy's embrace. Everyone in the lobby smiled. The boy buried his face against the dog's neck. "I thought you were gone." His father looked toward Lucy first, then Hannah, then Nathan, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We've been looking everywhere since this afternoon." Lucy stepped forward shyly. "I just found him." The man knelt in front of her. "You saved our family a lot of heartbreak tonight." Lucy looked toward Hannah before answering. "We all did." Hannah smiled quietly. Exactly the answer she had hoped for. The shelter employee completed a few forms while the family thanked them repeatedly. Before leaving, the little boy walked back toward Lucy. "You can visit Pepper sometime?" Lucy laughed. "I'd like that." As the family disappeared into the snowy evening, an unexpected silence settled over the lobby, the kind that follows something beautiful. Nathan glanced toward Hannah. "You know, what? This feels strangely familiar." She laughed. "I was thinking the same thing." Buddy nudged Hannah's hand with his nose. She scratched behind his ears. "I think he believes returning lost dogs is becoming our family tradition." Ethan smiled. "I'm okay with that." Lucy looked down at the blue knitted scarf still wrapped around her shoulders. She carefully untied it. "I should give this back." Hannah gently pushed her hands away. "No." Lucy's eyes widened. "But it's yours. It kept someone else warm before me." She smiled. "And now it's your turn." Lucy looked confused. "But what if you need it?" Hannah glanced toward Ethan, then toward Nathan, then at Buddy. Finally, she looked back at Lucy. "There will always be another scarf, but there won't always be another chance to remind someone they're not alone." Lucy held the soft wool carefully, almost reverently. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." Nathan watched the exchange without speaking. Months earlier, he had stood on his front porch watching Hannah disappear into a blizzard after refusing both money and a ride. That night, he had believed she was simply returning a dog. Now he understood she had been carrying something much larger, a way of living, one that quietly invited others to become part of it. As they walked outside, the snowfall had become lighter. Streetlights reflected gently across fresh snow, making the city glow beneath the winter sky. Lucy waited with her grandmother, who had finally arrived after receiving several worried phone calls. The elderly woman thanked everyone repeatedly before hugging Hannah. "I don't know how to repay you." Hannah smiled. "You already can." "How?" She looked down at Lucy. "When someone else needs help someday." "Let her be the one who notices." The grandmother nodded slowly. "I promise." Lucy suddenly ran back before getting into the car. She wrapped her arms around Hannah. "Thank you." Then she hugged Ethan. "Thank you." Finally, she bent down to hug Buddy, who responded by happily licking her cheek. Everyone laughed. As her grandmother's car disappeared down the snowy street, the blue scarf remained visible through the rear window until the taillights vanished into the distance. Nathan stood quietly beside Hannah. "You gave away the scarf." She nodded. "It wasn't really mine." He smiled. Claire would have liked that answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence carried gratitude more honestly than words. Weeks passed. Winter slowly gave way to spring once again. Reading Saturdays continued to grow. Children who had once arrived shy and uncertain now volunteered to read aloud to younger students. Parents organized neighborhood book drives. Retired teachers offered tutoring. High school students mentored elementary readers. The kindness Hannah had once believed was too small to matter had become something no single person could claim ownership of. One Saturday morning, while arranging books before the program began, Ethan looked through the library window. "Mom." She looked up. "What is it?" He pointed outside. Across the street, Lucy stood with her grandmother waiting at a crosswalk. Wrapped around her neck was the familiar blue-knitted scarf. Beside her stood another little girl, crying quietly over a dropped backpack that had spilled books across the wet sidewalk. Without hesitation, Lucy knelt down. She gathered every book, smiled, helped the girl wipe away her tears. Then she walked her safely across the street. Ethan watched the entire scene. He looked back at his mother. "You were right." "About what?" "Kindness really does find its way home." Hannah slipped her arm gently around his shoulders. "No, sweetheart." She smiled through tears that refused to stay hidden. "It doesn't just find its way home. It builds one." Outside, children hurried toward the library, their laughter echoing through the crisp morning air. Inside shelves waited patiently with thousands of stories still untold. And somewhere among those stories lived one that had begun with a mother, a lost dog, and a 2-mile walk through a snowstorm. Not because anyone became rich, not because anyone was rescued, but because one ordinary woman refused to let compassion depend on convenience. That single choice reached a lonely widower, protected a library, inspired a community, warmed a frightened little girl, and taught a new generation that the smallest acts of kindness often travel the farthest. The world rarely changes all at once. More often it changes exactly the way Hannah Bailey walked through that storm. One quiet step, then another. Every day we pass people carrying burdens we cannot see. A tired cashier, a single parent, a lonely neighbor, or a child who simply needs someone to believe in them. Most of the time, changing a life doesn't require extraordinary wealth or perfect circumstances. It begins with noticing. It begins with choosing compassion when convenience would be easier. Hannah never expected a reward for returning a lost dog. She simply refused to let someone else's heartbreak become easier for her because she was tired. In return, she didn't receive a miracle. She received something much more meaningful, the chance to continue doing work that mattered while keeping her dignity, her independence, and her values intact. Real kindness isn't a transaction, it's a chain. One thoughtful decision encourages another, and before long, people you've never even met begin carrying that kindness forward. You may never know whose future is brighter because of a small choice you made today, and perhaps that's exactly the point. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments so others can read your story too. If you believe the world still needs more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary good, please share this video with someone you care about and subscribe to join our growing community. Thank you for spending this time with us. And until our next story, keep looking for small chances to make someone's journey home a little warmer.